The Alpha King walked away from the crown. The words swept through the Moonspire temple like a sudden winter wind. Thousands of wolves stood frozen beneath towering silver arches as King Ronan Blackthorn descended the steps of the sacred platform without a single glance toward the throne waiting for him. The royal crown, forged centuries ago beneath the blessing of the moon goddess, remained untouched upon its velvet cushion. Noble families stared in disbelief. Elders exchanged worried glances. Even the priests seemed unable to speak. No king had ever abandoned his coronation. Not in living memory. Not in the oldest records preserved within the temple walls. Yet Ronan continued forward, his black ceremonial cloak trailing behind him as though the shadows themselves followed their king. The entire kingdom had gathered for this moment. Families had traveled hundreds of miles. Merchants had closed their shops. Children had climbed rooftops hoping to catch a glimpse of the future ruler. The celebration was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era. Instead, confusion spread across the temple like ripples across still water. At the edge of the crowd stood a young woman who had no idea her life was about to change forever. Her name was Lyra Ashford. Most people barely noticed her. That was normal. Being unnoticed had become part of her existence. Her simple gray servant dress blended into the background among the jeweled gowns and embroidered robes worn by the nobility. Her hands remained folded neatly in front of her. Her eyes stayed lowered. She had learned years ago that attracting attention rarely led to anything good. Around her, excited whispers filled the temple. Nobody was speaking to her. Nobody ever did unless they needed something carried, cleaned, or delivered. To the kingdom, Lyra was little more than a forgotten Omega. Rejected, unwanted, invisible. Yet as King Ronan stepped away from the throne, something stirred deep within the ancient foundations of the temple. The silver symbols carved into the marble floor shimmered briefly before fading again. No one seemed to notice except an elderly priest standing near the altar. His expression darkened. His fingers tightened around his ceremonial staff. Then, just as suddenly, the strange sensation disappeared. Outside, moonlight poured through enormous stained glass windows despite the bright afternoon sky. Pale silver beams stretched across the temple floor and settled near the back of the hall where Lyra stood. She shifted uncomfortably, unaware that several elderly priests had begun looking in her direction. Not because of who she was, but because of what they felt. Something ancient, something impossible. At the center of the temple, Ronan finally stopped walking. Every eye followed him. The future king turned slowly, his silver gaze sweeping across thousands of faces. His expression revealed nothing. No fear, no uncertainty, no explanation. Yet beneath his calm exterior, a strange pull tightened around his chest. For 3 nights, he had dreamed of moonlight and a voice he could not recognize. For 3 nights, he had awakened with the same feeling, as though destiny itself waited somewhere beyond his reach. He had ignored it. He had buried it beneath duty, responsibility, and years of preparation. But standing inside the temple now, with the crown only a few feet away, the feeling had become impossible to silence. Somewhere in this room, something was calling to him. Somewhere among the nobles, warriors, servants, and citizens gathered beneath the sacred ceiling, a thread of fate had begun to awaken. And neither the king nor the forgotten Omega standing at the edge of the crowd yet understood that before this day ended, the entire kingdom would witness a miracle no living wolf had seen in centuries. 3 days earlier, long before silver light flooded the Moonspire temple, and long before the kingdom witnessed an event no one could explain, Lyra Ashford began her morning the same way she always did. She woke before sunrise in a small servant room tucked beneath the eastern quarter of Moonspire City, pulled on her faded gray dress, and stepped into a world that rarely noticed she existed. The city was already stirring as she carried baskets of fresh linens through cobblestone streets still damp from the cool night air. Bakers opened their shutters. Merchants arranged colorful displays outside their shops. Royal banners fluttered from nearly every building in preparation for the coming coronation. Excitement filled the city like music. Everywhere people talked about the future king. Everywhere people celebrated. Everywhere except around Lyra. She moved quietly through the crowds, keeping her eyes lowered. It was easier that way. The fewer people noticed her, the fewer opportunities they had to remind her what she was. Rejected. The word had followed her for years. Sometimes it arrived as a whisper, sometimes as a careless laugh, sometimes as silence from people who looked right through her. Once, she had imagined a different future. When she was younger, she believed the moon goddess had a purpose for everyone. She believed kindness mattered. She believed being good was enough. But life had slowly worn those hopes thin, not through cruelty alone, but through countless small moments that taught her she did not belong. The merchant who greeted every customer except her. The families who moved their conversations elsewhere when she approached. The invitations that never arrived. The smiles that never lasted. None of those moments seemed important on their own. Yet together they built a quiet loneliness she carried every day. By midday she arrived at the estate where she worked. Wealthy families across Moonspire were hosting celebrations before the coronation, and preparations consumed the entire household. Lyra spent hours polishing silver trays, arranging flowers, and carrying supplies from room to room. Most people barely spoke to her. That was normal. She preferred it. Silence hurt less than disappointment. As afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, she entered the grand dining hall carrying fresh linens. Laughter echoed throughout the room. Several young nobles had gathered to discuss the upcoming ceremony. Their elegant clothing shimmered with expensive embroidery. Their confidence filled the hall. One of them glanced toward Lyra and smirked. She recognized the expression immediately. It was the look people wore when they thought she could not hear them. A moment later, another voice joined the conversation. Then another. Soft laughter followed. Lyra focused on her work and kept walking. She had learned not to react. Still, a familiar ache settled quietly inside her chest. Not anger, not sadness, just exhaustion. She was tired of being measured by something she could not change. Tired of carrying a label that seemed larger than her own name. That evening, after finishing her duties, she slipped away from the city and followed a narrow path leading into the hills overlooking Moonspire. The noise of the kingdom gradually faded behind her. Cool air brushed against her face. Above her, the first stars appeared. This was the one place where she felt peace. A small clearing rested near the edge of a ridge surrounded by ancient trees older than the kingdom itself. Lyra sat beneath their branches and watched moonlight slowly spread across the valley below. The city glowed in the distance like scattered lanterns. Somewhere among those lights, nobles celebrated and a future king prepared for destiny. Yet here, surrounded by silence, she felt something unexpected. A strange warmth drifted through the air. The leaves overhead rustled even though no wind moved through the forest. Lyra looked up. For a brief moment, she thought she saw pale silver light weaving between the branches. The glow vanished almost immediately. She blinked and shook her head. Perhaps she was simply tired. Yet as she rose to leave, a faint sensation lingered. It felt almost like being watched. Not by something frightening. Not by anything dangerous. But by something ancient. Something patient. Something that had finally begun to notice her. The following morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight and restless anticipation. Everywhere Lyra Ashford looked, Moonspire City seemed to pulse with excitement. Royal banners hung from balconies. Merchants decorated storefronts with silver ribbons. Children ran through crowded streets pretending to be kings and warriors. The coronation was only days away, and the entire kingdom appeared eager to celebrate. Lyra moved through the festivities unnoticed. She carried baskets of linens between estates, delivered supplies to merchants, and completed the endless tasks that filled her days. Few people looked at her. Fewer still spoke to her. Most simply saw another Omega who had somehow failed to find her place in the world. By afternoon, she arrived at the Ashbourne estate, where preparations for a noble gathering were already underway. Servants hurried between rooms while musicians rehearsed near the gardens. Lyra spent hours arranging tables and preparing refreshments before being asked to assist in the courtyard. The moment she stepped outside, she realized she was not alone. Several young nobles stood beneath a flowering archway discussing the upcoming coronation. Rowan Ashbourne occupied the center of the group, smiling confidently as always. Beside him stood another man Lyra recognized immediately. Her steps slowed. Tristan Hale. For a moment the sounds of the courtyard seemed to disappear. She had not spoken to him in over 2 years. Time had changed little. He still carried himself with effortless confidence. Still wore the same easy smile. Still looked like someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Once, long ago, Lyra had believed they might share a future. Then came the day he publicly rejected their bond. The memory remained as sharp as ever. Not because he had chosen someone else. Because afterward he had looked at her as though she were a mistake he preferred to forget. Tristan noticed her standing near the refreshment table. Recognition flashed across his face. Then came something colder. His fiancée, Arabella Sinclair, followed his gaze. "Do you know her?" she asked. Tristan hesitated only briefly. Years ago. The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, Rowan laughed. "You mean before you finally came to your senses?" Several nobles chuckled. Lyra lowered her eyes and focused on arranging glasses. She had no desire to become part of their entertainment. Unfortunately, they were not finished. Arabella tilted her head. "Wait, is she the Omega everyone used to talk about?" Rowan smiled. "The very one." Another round of laughter followed. Tristan remained silent. Somehow that hurt more than if he had joined them. Finally, he looked directly at Lyra. His expression was calm, polite, detached. "I hope life has been kind to you." The words sounded harmless. Yet both of them knew what remained unspoken. Before Lyra could answer, Rowan spoke again. "Kind enough, apparently. She is still here." More amusement rippled through the group. Lyra forced herself to remain composed. Years ago, comments like these would have sent her home in tears. Now they simply left her tired. "Excuse me," she said quietly. She turned to leave. Tristan's voice stopped her. "Lyra." She paused. "You should not let the past trouble you." His tone remained gentle, almost sympathetic. "Some wolves are chosen for certain paths. Others are not. That is simply the way of things." Silence followed. The statement was not cruel. It was worse. He genuinely believed it. Lyra felt a familiar ache settle inside her chest. Not because she wanted him back. Those feelings had disappeared long ago. The pain came from realizing that even now, after everything, he still viewed her as someone less. Someone unworthy of destiny. She nodded politely and walked away before anyone could see the sadness in her eyes. That evening she found herself once again beneath the ancient trees overlooking the city. The distant lights of Moonspire glittered below like scattered stars. Lyra stared at them in silence. For years she had wondered if Tristan had been right. If perhaps some people were simply meant to be forgotten. Then a strange silver glow appeared among the roots of the nearest tree. The light pulsed softly beneath the branches. This time it remained long enough for her to see it clearly. And somewhere deep within the forest, something ancient seemed to awaken. The final day arrived beneath a sky so clear it seemed polished by the moon goddess herself. From the earliest hours of the morning, Moonspire City overflowed with visitors. Wagons crowded the roads leading toward the capital. Flags bearing the royal crest fluttered from towers and balconies. Church bells echoed across the valley. Every conversation carried the same excitement. By sunset, King Ronan Blackthorn would officially ascend the throne. Lyra Ashford woke before dawn and joined dozens of other servants assigned to assist inside the Moonspire Temple. The sacred building stood at the heart of the city, its silver spires rising hundreds of feet into the sky. Even after seeing it countless times from a distance, entering its enormous gates always left her breathless. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows depicting ancient wolves, forgotten kings, and celestial symbols that glowed in shades of blue, gold, and silver across the marble floor. The temple felt less like a building and more like a place suspended between worlds. Throughout the morning, Lyra worked quietly beside other servants, arranging ceremonial cloths, carrying fresh flowers, and preparing seating areas for distinguished guests. Nobles from every territory gradually filled the hall. Their elegant clothing transformed the temple into a sea of color and movement. Musicians rehearsed softly near the entrance. Priests moved between aisles carrying sacred texts older than the kingdom itself. Everywhere Lyra looked, history seemed to gather beneath the vaulted ceilings. Yet despite the grandeur surrounding her, she remained what she had always been. Easy to overlook, easy to forget. Shortly before noon, she was assigned to assist near one of the side corridors connecting the temple to the guest chambers. The task was simple. Ensure refreshments remained available for visiting nobles. Avoid drawing attention. Remain out of the way. Lyra welcomed the assignment. Large crowds made her uncomfortable. Unfortunately, peace never lasted long. As she carried a tray through the corridor, familiar voices drifted toward her. Rowan Ashbourne stood with several young nobles discussing the ceremony. Their conversation paused when they noticed her approaching. The same knowing smiles appeared. The same expressions she had learned to recognize years ago. Rowan glanced at the tray in her hands and laughed softly. Look at that. Even on the most important day in the kingdom, some things never change. A few people chuckled. Lyra kept walking. She had no desire to become part of their entertainment. Careful, one young woman added with a smile. We would not want the future king distracted by a servant wandering into the wrong place. More laughter followed. Lyra felt her cheeks warm, but continued forward. She reminded herself that the day did not belong to her. It belonged to the kingdom. Yet even as she moved away, an odd sensation brushed against her skin. A faint warmth spread across her wrist. She stopped for a moment and looked down. Nothing appeared unusual. The feeling vanished almost immediately. By late afternoon, the temple reached capacity. Thousands of guests filled every available seat. The atmosphere vibrated with anticipation. Outside, crowds packed the surrounding streets hoping to witness even a glimpse of the ceremony. Inside, priests lit hundreds of silver candles whose reflections danced across polished stone. Lyra stood near the rear of the hall with the other servants as the first notes of ceremonial music echoed through the temple. Then the great doors opened. Silence swept across the crowd. King Ronan entered surrounded by royal guards and senior council members. Even from a distance, his presence commanded attention. His dark, formal attire contrasted sharply against the silver surroundings. His expression remained calm, composed, almost unreadable. Yet as he walked toward the sacred platform, something unexpected happened. A strange feeling tightened in his chest. Not fear, not uncertainty, recognition. His gaze shifted across the vast hall, as though searching for someone he had never met. At the same moment, the warmth returned to Lyra's wrist, stronger than before. She looked down again. This time a faint silver glow shimmered beneath her skin before disappearing. Her heart skipped. Around her, nobody seemed to notice. But high above the temple floor, carved into the ancient stone arch behind the throne, one forgotten symbol briefly flickered with pale moonlight before fading once more. The ceremony continued beneath towering silver arches as thousands of guests watched the sacred traditions unfold. Music echoed softly through the temple. Priests carried ancient relics toward the ceremonial platform. The kingdom stood only moments away from crowning its new ruler. Yet while excitement filled most of the hall, Lyra Ashford felt strangely out of place. Standing among the servants near the rear of the temple, she reminded herself that her job was simple. Remain unnoticed. Complete her duties. Leave quietly when the ceremony ended. It was a role she understood well. For years she had survived by making herself invisible. At the front of the hall, the chief priest began reciting blessings older than the kingdom itself. Hundreds of silver candles illuminated the marble floor. Guests watched in respectful silence. Lyra carried a tray of refreshments toward one of the side aisles and prepared to step aside. Then she heard a voice behind her. Not there. She turned. A noble woman wearing an elaborate silver gown looked at her with a polite smile. Servants belong behind the rear line during the coronation. The words were delivered gently enough that no one could call them cruel. Yet several nearby guests immediately looked toward Lyra. Heat rose to her cheeks. I apologize, she said softly. She stepped backward. Another nobleman glanced in her direction and laughed under his breath. Everyone wants a better view of history. A woman beside him smiled. Some people forget their place when they stand too close to greatness. A few guests chuckled quietly. The comments were small, forgettable. The kind people dismissed moments later. But for Lyra, they felt painfully familiar. She lowered her eyes and continued moving toward the back of the hall. Then she noticed someone standing among the nobles. Tristan Hale. Their eyes met briefly. For a moment, she hoped he might look away. Instead, he offered the same distant expression she remembered from years ago. Calm, detached, as though she were someone he barely knew. Beside him stood Arabella Sinclair. Beautiful, confident. Everything Lyra had once believed she was not. Arabella leaned closer to Tristan and whispered something. Both smiled faintly. Lyra quickly looked away. The old wound she thought had healed suddenly ached again. Not because she wanted the past back, because seeing him reminded her of every doubt she had spent years trying to overcome. She reached the rear of the hall and stopped beside one of the ancient stone pillars. Around her, The coronation continued. No one paid attention anymore. The nobles returned their focus to the ceremony. The priests continued their prayers. Lyra released a quiet breath and tried to steady her thoughts. Then the warmth beneath her wrist returned, stronger than ever before. She froze. The sensation spread through her arm like liquid silver. At first she thought she imagined it. Then a sharp gasp sounded nearby. Lyra looked down. A faint thread of light had appeared beneath her skin. Her eyes widened. The silver glow slowly traced across her wrist, forming delicate lines that seemed to move with a purpose of their own. Panic rushed through her chest. She instinctively pulled her sleeve lower. The light continued shining. A servant standing nearby stepped backward in shock. Another pointed toward her arm. Heads began turning. Conversations faded. Within seconds, dozens of eyes focused on her. Lyra felt trapped beneath their attention. The same people who had ignored her moments earlier now stared openly. The glowing lines continued spreading. Across the temple, ancient symbols carved into pillars and walls suddenly illuminated one by one. Guests rose from their seats. Confused whispers swept through the hall. The chief priest stopped speaking. Several elders stared in disbelief. High above the sacred platform, silver light burst through the stained glass image of the moon goddess and flooded the temple. The glow surrounding Lyra intensified. The intricate symbol on her wrist completed its final line and blazed with breathtaking brilliance. Silence crashed over the entire hall. Then, from the center of the sacred platform, King Ronan Blackthorn lifted his head. For the first time all day, the strange force calling to him became unmistakably clear. Across thousands of people, across the sacred hall, his eyes found Lyra instantly. And the moment their gazes met, every ancient symbol in the temple erupted with silver light. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The temple stood suspended in absolute silence beneath waves of silver light. Lyra Ashford could hear her own heartbeat. She could feel thousands of eyes fixed upon her. The mark glowing across her wrist illuminated her trembling hands, casting pale reflections across the marble floor. Confusion swirled through the crowd. Nobles exchanged nervous whispers. Priests stared in disbelief. Elders looked toward one another as though searching for answers hidden inside memories older than their own lifetimes. Lyra wished she could disappear. She did not understand what was happening. She did not understand why ancient symbols throughout the temple continued shining in response to her presence. Most of all, she did not understand why the king himself was looking directly at her. Across the hall, Ronan Blackthorn remained perfectly still. The strange certainty that had followed him for days now filled every corner of his mind. The feeling was no longer distant, no longer mysterious. It stood before him in the form of a young woman wearing a servant's dress near the back of the temple. Nothing about the situation made sense. Yet every instinct he possessed told him the same thing. What was unfolding mattered more than the crown waiting only feet away. The chief priest finally found his voice. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the coronation must continue." His words echoed through the enormous chamber. Several council members immediately nodded in agreement. Tradition demanded completion of the sacred ritual. The kingdom waited. The future of the realm waited. Every plan established over the past year depended upon this moment. Yet Ronan barely heard them. His eyes remained fixed on Lyra. Around her, silver light continued flowing across ancient carvings embedded within pillars and walls. Forgotten symbols glowed brighter with every passing second. Then something even stranger happened. High above the throne, a section of the temple ceiling began reflecting moonlight despite the late afternoon sky outside. A circular pattern emerged across the stonework. Elder priests gasped. One elderly woman dropped to her knees. Tears filled her eyes. "The celestial seal," she whispered. Several older priests immediately turned toward her. Fear and wonder crossed their faces simultaneously. That name had not been spoken publicly in generations. Most believed it belonged to mythology rather than history. The chief priest looked visibly shaken. "That cannot be possible," he murmured. The elderly woman slowly stood. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "The records describe this sign. The light. The symbols. The awakening." More whispers spread through the crowd. Ronan stepped away from the platform. A ripple of shock followed him. The movement seemed small, yet everyone understood its significance. He was moving away from the throne during the most sacred moment of the ceremony. Council members exchanged alarmed glances. One advisor hurried forward. "Your Majesty, please. The kingdom is watching." Ronan finally looked away from Lyra long enough to glance toward the waiting crown. For years he had prepared for this day. For years duty had guided every decision he made. Yet standing within the glowing temple, he realized something had changed. Not his responsibilities, not his commitment to his people. Something deeper, something older than any kingdom. He turned and continued walking, not toward the throne, toward the back of the hall. Gasps erupted throughout the temple. Lyra stared in disbelief as the king descended the platform steps and crossed the marble floor. Every footstep echoed through the silence. She instinctively stepped backward. Surely he could not be approaching her. Surely there had been some mistake. Yet he never slowed. The crowd parted before him. Nobles moved aside. Priests lowered their heads. The silver light surrounding the temple brightened as though responding to his decision. Finally, Ronan stopped only a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the crowd seemed to vanish completely. Lyra felt as though the entire world had narrowed to that single instant. Then the mark upon her wrist flared brighter than ever before, and somewhere deep beneath the temple, an ancient bell rang once despite having remained silent for hundreds of years. The ancient bell's echo lingered through the Moonspire temple long after the sound itself had faded. It rolled across the vaulted ceilings, settled among the silver pillars, and left behind a silence so complete that even breathing seemed too loud. Lyra Ashford stood motionless beneath the glow of her moon mark. The silver symbol upon her wrist pulsed softly, casting pale light across her trembling fingers. Thousands of eyes remained fixed on her. Only an hour earlier, most of those people had not known her name. Now they stared as though they were witnessing the return of something thought lost forever. King Ronan Blackthorn stood only a few feet away. The strange pull that had haunted his dreams for days now felt undeniable. Every instinct told him that whatever had awakened inside the temple was connected to the young Omega standing before him. Yet even he could not explain why. Around them, confusion spread through the crowd. Nobles whispered among themselves. Council members exchanged uneasy glances. Several priests looked visibly shaken. The coronation had stopped completely. No one seemed certain what should happen next. Then an elderly priest suddenly rushed toward the sealed archive chamber hidden behind the altar. Others quickly followed. Their urgency immediately drew attention. The archive was rarely opened. Most sacred records stored there had not been touched in generations. Minutes passed. The tension inside the temple grew heavier. Then the priests returned carrying a massive silver-bound volume coated in dust. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some guests recognized it immediately. Others believed it existed only in stories. The Chronicle of the First Moon, the oldest surviving record in the kingdom. Carefully, the priests placed the enormous book upon a ceremonial stand. The oldest among them, High Priestess Ilaria, stepped forward. Her silver hair shimmered beneath the temple light. Her hands trembled as she opened the ancient pages. Not from age, from anticipation. She searched through faded passages written centuries before the kingdom itself had taken its current form. Suddenly she stopped. Her eyes widened. For several seconds, she simply stared at the page. Then tears appeared. The entire temple watched in silence. Finally, she lifted her gaze. "For 300 years," she said softly, "we believed this passage referred to a future that might never come." No one moved. No one spoke. Ilaria began reading. Her voice carried throughout the hall. "When pride blinds the kingdom and worth is measured by power, the moon shall place her mark upon the forgotten one. The chosen light shall rise not from the throne, nor from noble blood, but from the soul that remained true when no one was watching." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Lyra felt her heart pounding. The priestess continued. "The sacred bell shall awaken. The ancient seal shall answer. And the king shall abandon what was promised in order to find what was chosen." Gasps erupted across the temple. Every eye turned toward Ronan. The words described exactly what had just happened. The king himself appeared stunned. The prophecy had been written centuries before his birth, yet somehow it spoke directly to this moment. Several nobles immediately objected. Voices rose from different corners of the hall. Ancient texts can be interpreted many ways. This changes nothing. The coronation must continue. Fear hid beneath many of the arguments. Others simply refused to accept what stood before them. Rowan Ashbourne stared at Lyra with open disbelief. Only days earlier he had mocked her. Tristan Hale looked equally shaken. The confidence he once carried had vanished. For years he had believed destiny favored strength, status, and influence. Yet the moon goddess had chosen none of those things. She had chosen Lyra. The realization unsettled him more than he wished to admit. Meanwhile, Lyra struggled to understand any of it. She was not powerful. She was not important. She had spent most of her life believing she would leave no mark upon the world. Why would an ancient prophecy point toward someone like her? As doubt filled her thoughts, warmth spread through the moon mark. The sensation flowed gently through her chest, like reassurance. Not demanding belief, simply offering comfort. For the first time since the mark appeared, fear began to loosen its grip. Across the hall, Ronan watched her quietly. The prophecy explained the signs. It explained the bell. It explained the light. Yet none of those things mattered as much as one simple truth. When he looked at Lyra, the feeling of certainty remained. Not because a prophecy commanded it, because something deep inside him recognized her. Around them, arguments continued. Doubts remained. Questions multiplied. But beneath the glow of ancient symbols and sacred moonlight, one fact had become impossible to deny. The kingdom had gathered expecting to witness the rise of a king. Instead, it had just witnessed destiny, choosing someone no one thought worthy of being seen. The temple erupted into debate. Noble families rose from their seats. Council members argued across the marble floor. Priests attempted to restore order, but their voices were swallowed by the growing storm of confusion. The prophecy had changed everything. What began as a coronation had become something entirely different. Lyra Ashford stood at the center of the chaos, wishing she could disappear. The silver mark upon her wrist continued glowing softly, impossible to hide and impossible to deny. Every gaze seemed fixed on her. Some carried wonder. Others carried suspicion. A few carried resentment. She felt as though the entire kingdom had suddenly turned toward her at once. Rowan Ashbourne looked stunned. Tristan Hale looked pale. Neither man seemed capable of understanding how the forgotten Omega they once dismissed had become the focus of the most important day in the kingdom's history. Near the sacred platform, several senior council members gathered around King Ronan Blackthorn. Their expressions were tense. One elderly advisor finally stepped forward. "Your Majesty, this situation is unprecedented." His voice remained respectful, but urgency filled every word. The kingdom requires stability. The coronation must continue. Several nobles immediately voiced their agreement. The people have traveled for weeks. The kingdom cannot be left without a crowned ruler. Ancient prophecies should not overturn centuries of tradition. The objections continued. Some came from fear, some from pride, some from genuine concern for the future. Ronan listened quietly. He understood every argument. In truth, he had spent his entire life preparing for this exact moment. Every lesson from his father, every sacrifice, every responsibility, everything had led to the crown waiting only yards away. Then another council member spoke. This one carried greater weight. "If you walk away now, the ceremony ends." Silence followed. The man continued carefully. "The sacred sequence cannot simply be restarted. The kingdom may never accept another coronation. The uncertainty could last for years." The words landed heavily throughout the temple. Even Lyra felt their significance. This was no symbolic choice. This was real. A king was being asked to risk everything he had worked toward. For the first time, genuine fear filled her heart. Not for herself. For him. She looked toward Ronan. Surely now he would return to the throne. Surely duty would win. How could it not? Thousands of people depended upon him. The kingdom depended upon him. Yet Ronan remained silent for a long moment. His gaze drifted toward the crown. Silver light reflected from its polished surface. The future everyone expected waited there. Safe. Predictable. Accepted. Then he looked toward Lyra. She stood alone near the back of the hall, surrounded by uncertainty she never asked for. He remembered the fear in her eyes, the humility, the complete absence of ambition. She had not sought attention. She had not sought power. The moon had chosen her anyway. In that moment, Ronan understood something important. Leadership was not about protecting tradition when truth stood before you. Leadership was having the courage to follow truth even when it demanded sacrifice. The temple fell completely silent as he finally spoke. For generations, our kingdom has claimed to honor the moon goddess. His voice carried effortlessly throughout the hall. We teach our children to trust her guidance. We build temples in her name. We ask for her blessings. He paused. What meaning do those beliefs hold if we ignore her when she answers? No one responded. No one could. Ronan turned fully toward Lyra. The silver light surrounding the temple brightened in response. The kingdom gathered here expecting me to choose a crown. His voice softened. Today I am being asked to choose something greater. The tension inside the hall became almost unbearable. Then, before thousands of witnesses, Ronan stepped away from the throne completely and began walking toward Lyra. This time there was no hesitation in his movement. No uncertainty. Only conviction. Around them, the ancient symbols embedded throughout the temple blazed brighter than ever before, as though the kingdom itself had just witnessed the moment destiny prevailed over fear. Silence settled across the Moonspire temple as King Ronan Blackthorn stepped forward. Not a fragile silence. Not the silence of confusion. This was the kind of silence that appears when thousands of people realize they are witnessing a moment that will outlive them all. The royal crown remained untouched upon the sacred platform. Priests stood motionless. Nobles forgot their arguments. Even the council members who had opposed him seemed unable to speak. Every eye followed the future king as he crossed the marble floor toward the forgotten Omega, standing beneath the glow of the moon mark. Lyra Ashford felt her breath catch in her throat. For years, she had learned to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. Attention had rarely brought kindness. Yet now the most powerful man in the kingdom walked toward her while the entire realm watched. She wanted to step back. She wanted to disappear into the crowd. Instead, she remained where she was, unable to move. Ronan stopped only a few feet away. The silver light surrounding the temple reflected in his eyes. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Not at the moon mark. Not at the prophecy. Not at the miracle unfolding around them. At her, as though he saw something everyone else had missed. Then, before thousands of witnesses, Ronan lowered himself onto one knee. A collective gasp swept through the temple. Some nobles stared in disbelief. Others covered their mouths. Rowan Ashbourne looked completely stunned. Nearby, Tristan Hale stood frozen. The confidence that had once defined him seemed to vanish entirely. Ronan lifted his gaze toward Lyra. When he spoke, his voice carried effortlessly throughout the hall. For years, they told you what you were not. The words hung in the air. Not important enough. Not strong enough. Not worthy enough. Tears immediately filled Lyra's eyes. Ronan continued. They measured your value by titles, by status, by what they could see. His gaze briefly moved across the gathered nobles. And they were wrong. Silence followed. Not because people disagreed. Because deep down many of them knew it was true. Tristan lowered his head. Memories flooded his mind. Every assumption he had made. Every opportunity he had ignored. Every moment he had mistaken gentleness for weakness. For the first time, he understood that the fault had never been hers. Around him, other nobles seemed equally uncomfortable. They had all seen Lyra countless times. Yet none of them had truly looked. Ronan turned back toward her. Emotion softened his expression. The moon never forgot you. A tear slipped down Lyra's cheek. Years of loneliness pressed against her heart. The rejection, the whispers, the feeling of never belonging anywhere. Ronan's next words shattered those burdens more completely than any prophecy ever could. The kingdom failed to see you. He paused. I will not. The silver mark upon Lyra's wrist blazed brighter than ever before. Moonlight poured through the stained glass windows, illuminating every corner of the temple. Ancient symbols awakened across pillars and archways. It felt as though the moon goddess herself stood among them. Then Ronan spoke words no one expected. If honoring truth costs me a crown, then the crown was never worth wearing. Shock rippled through the crowd. The statement carried more power than any royal decree. This was not a king choosing destiny because it was easy. This was a man choosing truth despite the cost. One by one, people throughout the temple slowly rose to their feet. First the servants, then merchants, then warriors. Soon hundreds stood in silent respect. An elderly woman near the front whispered through tears, "She never changed." Another servant nodded. "We were the ones who never looked." The realization spread through the crowd like dawn breaking across a dark horizon. Lyra felt something inside her begin to heal. Not because she had gained power, not because she had gained status, because she no longer felt invisible. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. The moon mark shimmered brilliantly. Then new silver lines emerged beside the original symbol. The pattern expanded across her wrist, forming markings none of the gathered scholars recognized. The elderly priests immediately noticed. Their expressions shifted from celebration to astonishment. One hurried toward the ancient prophecy book and opened it with trembling hands. His eyes raced across the faded text. Suddenly he stopped. His face drained of color. "No," he whispered. "That is impossible." Several priests rushed toward him. "What is it?" one demanded. The old priest slowly lifted his head and looked directly at Lyra. Wonder mixed with fear inside his eyes. The prophecy continues. A chill swept through the temple. Outside, clouds parted across the evening sky. Moonlight flooded the kingdom brighter than anyone had ever seen. Far beyond Moonspire, beyond forests, mountains, and forgotten ruins, something ancient stirred from a slumber older than recorded history. Not because a king had chosen a crown, not because a prophecy had been fulfilled, but because Lyra Ashford had finally been seen. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the kingdom, something had awakened in response.